And would you now welcome to the podium Associate Professor Paulo Caballero, who will present the Harry Stobbs Memorial Lecture, Can Grazing Behaviour Support Innovations in Grassland Management? Paulo is from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul and from Brazil. Would you welcome Paulo Caballero? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the organization for this invitation, and I would like as well express my gratitude with this invitation by the Harry Stobbs Memorial Fund. I'm really honored by this invitation. I have no vocabulary to express my gratitude. So I will talk about these issues about grazing behavior. How can grazing behavior support innovations in grassland management? This presentation pays tribute to Harry Stobbs. Harry Stobbs was a leading scientist in grazing behavior research, mainly in tropical pastures. And his work influenced many researchers around the world, including me. And he was a pioneer in working with grazing behavior in tropical pastures. And his willing was that results of scientific research would reach practicing farmers in the field and be adopted. So in this context, I will present this lecture. And the context in which I will present is that I think that despite huge advances in plant-animal interface in the late 70s and mostly in the 90s, there are no clear evidence of how grazing behavior has produced innovations in pasture management. It's worth noting that recent publications, as that of Fred Provenza and co-authors, in which they criticized the traditional inability of researchers to create innovative process. Another recent paper from Van den Pol van Desselaar concluded, using a survey in the European Grassland Federation, that no major developments in grazing systems management were recently occurring. So this presentation pays tribute to Harry Stobbs by reviewing grazing behavior research that aims to support grazing management innovations. The proposed outline of this presentation, I will present new evidence on how pasture structure limits forage intake in homogeneous and heterogeneous pastures. Then I will talk about pasture management strategies designed to maximize biomass and forage intake per unit grazing time. And finally, and briefly, I will present a Brazilian case study called PISA to illustrate how grazing behavior research can reach farmers and change their lives by using new management strategies based on pasture targets related to grazing behavior. So, to present the basis of our thought, I use this classical demonstration on how animal performance is built by daily intake, by bite mass, and bite characteristics. So spatial and temporal scales of grazing. And for all that I will talk to you is based upon the relationships between bite mass and intake rate, and the close relationship between intake rate, daily intake, and animal performance. So we will focus a lot on bite mass and intake rate, assuming that when we manage pastures that optimize intake rate, we will probably be increasing daily intake and animal performance. So let's start with ingestible behavior generation tools for grazing management, focusing on more heterogeneous pastures. This is a pasture from southern Brazil. It's a Pampa native grasslands. In these grasslands we have almost two different structures, two-socks and inter-two-socks areas that which represent different plant strategies. The frequency and distribution of these different structures is a function of grazing intensity. The higher the grazing intensity, the lower the presence of two-socks and the lower the diversity in floristic and functional terms. It was a video, it's not working. Anyway, we are building now bite golden grids for animals grazing those complex vegetation, trying to understand at bite level what the animals are supposing to graze, which part of each plant is being grazed at a bite per bite level in the temporary scale up to daily scale. And just for illustration, you can see here that when grazing intensity is higher, let's say low forage allowance, the types of bite available for the animals are lower. The bite mass, the mass of each bite is also lower. When we use moderate grazing intensity, there are more probabilities, more diversity in floristic availability for the animal. Bite masses are higher, so moderate grazing promotes bite diversity. Moderate grazing promotes diversity in the floristic vegetation, and in turn, floristic vegetation allows for higher bite diversity. This is an example. We have data on long-term experiments of this nature showing that moderate grazing with this kind of diversity in diet selection promotes not only pasture production but also individual animal production. So we are trying to build the two most important pasture structure characteristics that influence grazing intake and animal production are two-sock frequency and pasture high. And when we measure instantaneous intake rate according to the frequency of two-socks and according to the pasture high in the inter-two-sock area, we can build pasture structural threshold for the management of those native pastures. So, grazing intake decreases when two-sock, the percentage of stocks is higher than 35%, and when the high of the inter-two-sock area is lower than 12 centimeters. So this is an example of how we build pasture targets in heterogeneous pastures using instantaneous intake rate as illustrate how we are building pasture targets focusing on rotational grazing. Let's start by defining pre-grazing targets using animal behavior assessments. I show here two different experiments with tropical and temperate pastures in which we try to define the best sward height for animal grazing. So here you have bite mass showing here, instantaneous intake rate for Synodon and for Avena strigosa, for Avena. And there is a close relationship between bite mass and instantaneous intake rate. There is no difference between rotational and continuous grazing. So using this approach, we can define the best pre-grazing pasture targets for the entrance of the animals in the paddock. Always assuming that in optimizing instantaneous intake rate, we will be probably optimizing daily intake and animal performance. This figure is a data set of tropical and temperate pastures in which we relate bite mass to time per bite. And these are new evidences of non-quality factors affecting intake rates in tropical pastures, because for the same bite mass in tropical pastures, animals, the time per bite is higher in tropical pastures than in temperate ones. So this is because there is an increase in non-beating jaw movements for the same bite mass in tropical pastures. So this is a new evidence that pasture structure in tropical pastures have been, let's say, neglected, and forage quality is probably being overweighted in determining the limitations of intake and animal production in tropical pastures. To define post-grazing targets, some examples. So these are two different experiments where grazing, the instantaneous intake rate is measured along a grazing down, both starting with the pre-grazing target, let's say the higher instantaneous intake rate, and then we measure the instantaneous intake rate up to the lowest herbage mass possible that animals capture. And you can see very interestingly that there is a close relationship in the moment in which the grazing intake declines. And this occurs when almost 45% of the initial sward high is depleted. And I'm showing this data with sorghum bicolor and Synodon, but we have a lot of, have more species, and all the species with different structures works in the same way. So this originates what we call as a rule of the take the best and leave the rest, that will support the grazing management strategies that I will show further. And this decrease in intake rate when pasture high is depleted by 40%, 50% of the initial sward high is because from this level there is a huge increase in grazing jaw movements per unit grazing dry matter intake. And this is a consequence of the depletion of leaf mass in the structure. So to finally build or to show how we build these grazing management strategies, I finally have to say that animals graze pastures by succeeding layers. So mostly in rotational grazing, animals graze by horizon, and exceeds deeply in the horizon for how long they are in the staying period in the paddock. And so this dynamic is defined by the time animals stays in the paddock, and the deeper the animals goes in this structure, the lower is the bite mass and the lower is the forage quality that animals ingest. And to explain these dynamics, it's important to say that there is a close relationship between bite depth and the sward height. Animals graze in a certain constancy of tissue removal, and this is what is showing by this graph. Let's say for each sward hay that animals graze, they graze this sward hay by almost about the half of this high. So this is a kind of illustration of how animals graze horizon by horizon. And to define when animals should stay in the paddock, so I show here another protocol, different protocol with continuous and rotational, with synodon and swides and sorghum B column, showing that this the stocking, the instantaneous intake rate drops when 70% of the surface in the paddock is already grazed. So if animals stays for longer, the instantaneous intake rate will drop very quickly. So bearing this in mind, we try to build different proposals for grazing management and aiming to optimize instantaneous intake rate when animals enter in a paddock and they stay in that paddock when this instantaneous intake rate remains at its maximum level. When it begins to drop, we move animals for the next paddock. So the post-grazing herbage mass is higher than usual. So to show a little bit of how we are applying these concepts at practical situations, I will show briefly the experience, this case study of Pisa, which is being applied in the very southern part of Brazil. We are this year working with 575 families of small stakeholders that have dairy system as the most important system in their farms, but they have also bean and maize and so on. So they work in a mixed crop livestock integration. So this program started in 2008 with one farm, and this year we have 575 families working in this type of participatory approach. Grazing management is not the only thing that we work at farm level. The PISA project works also with conservation agriculture, with soil erosion control and good farming practices, animal welfare and so on. But grazing management, because of dairy at farm level is the most important activity in the farm. On the average, in the first year, the farmers milk 14 lactating cows, and they produce a total daily milk production of approximately 150 liters. So they are really small families with small farms. And in this situation, this proposal is quite important. Time to gather herbage along the day, because grazing competes with milking, the milking process, and animals don't reach their demand. This is illustrated here. They don't reach together all the mass they need in a daily scale. So grazing is a time-consuming process. So when we propose grazing management based in optimizing the dry matter intake per unit grazing time, this is quite important for this kind of system. So here I illustrate the post-grazing pasture masses that farmers begins to work. This is quite difficult for them in the beginning because they are familiar. They are usually make cows graze up to no leaf in the stubble. So this is quite difficult for them. And when we look at tropical pastures, even more contrasted with precedent management. So this is panicum pastures and the post-grazing structure. So when what it occurs when we use this management? The paddocks begins greater. The intensity in each visit of the animal is lower, but the frequency is higher. So animals, the resting period that was almost 3 weeks to 4 weeks, it drops to up to 1 week. So the system works differently, and in this kind of rotational grazing, the pasture structure seems to continuous structure. So for that, colloquially, they are namely Rotatínuos grazing in southern Brazil. So this is a huge success, at least in that region in Brazil. They are being applied as well in the central part of Brazil, but the experience with more years is in southern Brazil. And on average of these farmers, after 1 year of this project, there is an increase in 30% of milk yield per cow, and decrease in 20% in feeding cost. From 14, the farmers increased to 19 milking cows in the same area, and the milk production from 48 to 11,215 kilograms per hectare. There is another types of effects, for example, an increase in organic matter, not only by the management, also because we work with an no-till and other practice. And for each one reais that we put on the project, the profit is 6 reais. And one thing that farmers are quite happy is that there is less labor involved in the system. But I think that the most important result is that with new level of production, new level of yield, farmers have a new horizons for their lives in the farm. So this is leading to keeping stakeholders in their lands. So to conclude briefly, I was telling you that it's very difficult for the first time for farmers leave post-grazing masses with higher high. But one thing very interesting in dairy systems is that when they try to do it, when they for the first time do it, dairy cow respond the next day during the week. So this is quite interesting to see how they become confident with this proposal. So to conclude, I would say that appropriate use of grazing behavior can support innovations in grassland management, but this is not the current trend because the anthropogenic way of thinking determines management actions based on human goals, for example, for the harvest efficiency, that rarely correspond with animal goals. Well, this is quite important. I think that we manage pastures trying to reach our own goals and not managing for animal goals. So in this sense, to conclude, there is a huge potential to include consideration of grazing behavior when making primary management decisions in grassland ecosystems, as the visionary Harry Stobbs identified so many years ago. I would like to thank the Grazing Research Ecology Research Group, some of my students, and consequences of long-term sampling, the enthusiasm, lessons about biodiversity, the lessons that we learn with the elders, the predecessors, and the collaboration that we are building in southern Brazil. I thank you for your attention.